The Valorians had run out of options. For years they had relied on their advanced diplomacy, their technological prowess, and their ability to avoid conflict at all costs. But now, none of that mattered. The Kyran were at their doorstep, and every defense the Valorians had built was crumbling. Their once mighty fleets had been reduced to scattered remnants, barely holding the line against the relentless onslaught. The Kyran were everything the Valorians were not: brutal, war-hardened, and merciless. Where the Valorians sought to resolve conflicts through negotiation, the Kyran thrived on domination and destruction. They didn't conquer for resources or territory. They conquered because it was in their nature. It was how they proved their superiority. They had cut through the Valorian defenses like a blade through silk, leaving a trail of ruin in their wake. Desperation had driven the Valorians to make a decision they never thought they'd have to consider: asking humanity for help. In the grand scheme of the galaxy, humanity was a relatively new player. Most species considered them little more than a curiosity, young, impulsive, lacking the refinement of the older, more established civilizations. But there had been whispers. Whispers that humanity, despite their outward appearance, possessed a military that was unlike any other. The Valorians had hoped they would never have to find out if those whispers were true. The Council of Valorian Elders convened, their once serene chamber now filled with tension. Their leader, Elder Marin, had resisted the idea of reaching out to humanity for as long as possible. But with the Kyran poised to overrun their capital world, there was no choice left. "We have no other options," Marin said, his voice heavy with the weight of their impending doom. "The Kyran will not stop until we are destroyed. Our defenses are failing, and if we don't act now, it will be the end of us." The other elders nodded, their faces pale and drawn. They had once believed their technology and peaceful nature would protect them from the horrors of war. Now, that belief lay shattered at their feet. A message was sent to Earth, humbling as it was for the Valorians to request aid from a species they barely understood. They knew the risks. Humanity might refuse, might see no reason to involve themselves in a war that did not concern them. But they had to try. The response from Earth came swiftly. Humanity agreed to send a fleet. Relief washed over the Valorians, but it was short-lived. When the details of the fleet's composition came through, their hope turned to confusion and disbelief. The humans were sending a small fleet, insignificant compared to the massive armadas the Valorians had once fielded. The ships, by the Valorian standards, were outdated and unimpressive. "This is what they send to save us," one of the elders muttered, unable to mask his frustration. "We're facing annihilation, and they send a relic fleet? Have they no understanding of the threat we face?" Elder Marin, too, was troubled. He had expected more from the humans. The stories of their military prowess had given him hope, but now it seemed as if humanity was treating their plight as little more than a minor inconvenience. Still, there was nothing more they could do. The human fleet was en route, and the Valorians could only pray that it would somehow be enough. But in their hearts, doubt gnawed at them. How could these humans, with their small, outdated ships, possibly stand against the might of the Kyran? As the days passed and the Kyran fleet loomed ever closer, the Valorians prepared for what they believed would be their final stand. Their forces, already depleted and demoralized, had little hope of holding the line for long. The Kyran had broken through every defense they had erected, and it seemed only a matter of time before their worlds fell one by one. When the human fleet finally arrived, the Valorians were underwhelmed, to say the least. The ships that descended into their orbit were far from impressive. They lacked the sleek designs of Valorian craft, and they didn't possess the sheer size and firepower of the Kyran warships. To the Valorians, it was a fleet that looked as if it had been pulled from a museum. The Valorian military commanders were quick to voice their concerns. They questioned why humanity would send such an inadequate force in the face of overwhelming odds. Did they not understand the gravity of the situation? Were they so arrogant as to believe this paltry fleet could stand against the Kyran? "We're doomed," one of the Valorian commanders muttered. "This is nothing more than a token force. They've sent us to die." Elder Marin stood in silence, his eyes fixed on the human fleet. He, too, was beginning to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake in reaching out to Earth. Perhaps the humans had sent this fleet to fulfill their diplomatic obligation, without any real intention of helping. Perhaps they had already written the Valorians off as a lost cause. But the human admiral, calm and composed, responded to the Valorians' concerns with a quiet confidence that unnerved them. He did not seem worried about the size of his fleet, or the power of the enemy they were about to face. He simply told the Valorians to trust the plan. Trust the plan? Marin repeated, incredulous. We're on the verge of extinction, and you tell us to trust the plan? The Admiral gave a slight nod, his expression unchanged. We've dealt with enemies like this before. Just give us the time we need. Marin had no choice but to accept the Admiral's words, though doubts still gnawed at him. The Valorians had pinned their last hopes on humanity, and now it seemed as though those hopes were resting on the shoulders of a small fleet that had no business being in this fight. The Kyran fleet drew closer, and the tension on the Valorian worlds grew unbearable. They had seen what the Kyran were capable of: whole cities turned to ash, civilizations wiped out in the blink of an eye. And now they were next. As the first signs of the Kyran ships appeared on the Valorian scanners, there was a sense of inevitability in the air. The human fleet, small and unimpressive as it was, moved into position. The Valorian commanders watched with a mixture of disbelief and despair. They were about to witness their final moments, and it seemed as though the humans had only come to watch it happen. But what the Valorians did not understand, what they could not see, was that humanity had a history of making the impossible possible. They had faced extinction before. They had fought against odds that should have broken them. And every time, they had emerged stronger. What looked like humanity's weakest fleet was far from it. The Valorians were about to learn that humans, more than any other species, knew how to turn the tide when all hope seemed lost. They had called for help, and help had arrived, just not in the way they had expected. The human fleet had arrived, and the Valorians watched as these seemingly outdated ships took their positions. Their disappointment was palpable. To them, these vessels were relics compared to the sleek, advanced warships they had once possessed. The human admiral, however, remained calm and collected, issuing orders with a steady hand, as if oblivious to the doubt that filled the Valorian ranks. The Kyran fleet, by contrast, was nothing short of terrifying. Their ships were massive, bristling with weaponry, each one designed for total annihilation. They moved into Valorian space with the confidence of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. Their approach was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment before the kill. As the Valorian commanders watched the Kyran fleet bear down on their position, they couldn't help but feel a surge of fear. The Kyran had crushed every force they'd encountered, and now, they were facing what appeared to be little more than a ragtag fleet of outdated human ships. "This is madness," one of the Valorian generals muttered. "They're going to slaughter us." The Kyran, too, seemed unimpressed by the human fleet. Scanners revealed nothing remarkable about the ships, no advanced weaponry, no formidable defenses. In fact, the Kyran warlord leading the assault barely acknowledged their presence, focusing instead on the remnants of the Valorian forces that stood in his way. Humanity had entered the stage, but to the Kyran, they were background noise, an insignificant detail in a battle that was all but decided. But then something curious happened. The human fleet didn't immediately engage the enemy. Instead, they took up defensive positions, their ships aligning in precise formations. The Valorians, confused by this, questioned the human admiral. "Why aren't you attacking?" they asked, desperation creeping into their voices. "We don't have time to wait." The admiral's response was calm, almost indifferent. "We are waiting for the right moment." To the Valorians, it made no sense. They were facing imminent destruction, and here the humans were, sitting idly by, as if they had all the time in the world. Did they not understand the gravity of the situation? The Kyran, noticing the humans' lack of aggression, took it as a sign of weakness. They had faced countless species in battle, and hesitation was always the first sign of defeat. The Kyran warlord ordered his fleet to begin probing attacks, testing the humans' resolve. Small squadrons of Kyran fighters darted forward, firing upon the human fleet, expecting them to break ranks or retreat. But they didn't. Instead, the humans responded with precise, calculated maneuvers. Their ships, though small and seemingly underpowered, moved with surprising agility, weaving through the incoming fire with ease. They didn't retaliate with overwhelming force, as the Valorians had expected. Instead, they returned fire sparingly, with surgical precision, taking out Kyran fighters one by one. The Valorian commanders watched, baffled. They had expected the humans to be overwhelmed, to be crushed by the sheer power of the Kyran fleet. But instead, the humans seemed to be playing a different game altogether. Every move was deliberate, every shot carefully calculated. It was as if they were holding back, waiting for something the Valorians couldn't see. The Kyran warlord grew irritated. His fleet had been sent to annihilate the Valorians, not to engage in this slow, methodical exchange with a minor force. He ordered a more aggressive push, sending larger cruisers forward to test the humans' mettle. The human fleet responded in kind. But still, they did not unleash the full fury of their forces. They moved with an eerie calm, their ships shifting positions in perfect unison. They were biding their time, but for what, the Valorians still didn't understand. To the Kyran, this was nothing more than a delay. Their overwhelming numbers and firepower would soon crush the humans, just as they had every other species foolish enough to stand in their way. But as the battle dragged on, the warlord began to notice something unsettling. His fleet wasn't gaining the upper hand as quickly as expected. In fact, for every Kyran ship that advanced, a human vessel was there to block its path. And every time the Kyran tried to shift their strategy, the humans were already one step ahead, adjusting their positions, cutting off routes, and thinning the Kyran ranks with each engagement. "They're anticipating us," the warlord muttered, a frown creasing his brow. He ordered his tactical officers to analyze the human movements, but the data didn't make sense. How could such a small, seemingly insignificant fleet be holding its own against the might of the Kyran? Back on the Valorian command deck, the tension was unbearable. The Valorian commanders, still unsure of the human strategy, watched the battle unfold with growing anxiety. They had expected a quick and brutal defeat, but what they were seeing was something else entirely. The humans weren't winning in the conventional sense. They weren't overwhelming the Kyran with superior firepower or numbers, but they weren't losing either. They were holding their ground, and they were doing it with an efficiency that defied explanation. "How are they doing this?" one of the Valorian officers asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Their ships, they're old, outdated. But they're moving like they know exactly what the Kyran are going to do." The human admiral's voice broke through the confusion. "We've been studying the Kyran for a while now," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "They rely on brute strength, on overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers and firepower. But they're predictable. They don't adapt, and they don't think outside the box. We do." The Valorians exchanged glances, still not fully grasping what was happening. But as the battle continued, the truth became undeniable. The humans weren't fighting the Kyran with superior technology or greater numbers. They were fighting them with superior tactics, with a strategy that the Kyran simply couldn't counter. The human fleet wasn't just reacting to the Kyran's attacks. They were controlling the flow of the battle. Every move the Kyran made, the humans were there to block it. Every time the Kyran tried to press their advantage, the humans were ready, turning the enemy's aggression against them. The Kyran warlord, now visibly frustrated, ordered his forces to pull back and regroup. It was a move born of desperation, something he had never been forced to do in all his years of conquest. But even as he ordered the retreat, the humans moved in, cutting off his escape routes and closing the noose around his fleet. The Valorians watched in stunned silence as the human fleet, which they had so greatly underestimated, executed maneuver after maneuver with flawless precision. What they had thought was humanity's weakness was, in fact, their greatest strength. They weren't relying on brute force to win this battle. They were outsmarting their enemy at every turn. As the Kyran fleet struggled to regain control, the Valorians began to realize the full scope of what they were witnessing. The humans weren't fighting like any species they had ever encountered. They weren't bound by the same rules of warfare that the rest of the galaxy followed. They were rewriting those rules in real time, adapting, adjusting, and turning what should have been a one-sided slaughter into a carefully orchestrated chess match. And the Kyran were losing. The Kyran warlord could hardly believe what he was seeing. His fleet, which had crushed countless civilizations, was now being systematically dismantled by what appeared to be a vastly inferior force. His ships were larger, more heavily armed, and more advanced by any measure. Yet, every time he tried to press an advantage, the humans countered. Every time he attempted to outflank them, they were already in position. This wasn't just a battle anymore, it was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Frustration turned to rage. He slammed his fist on the command console, barking orders to his fleet. "Crush them! Stop playing with these insects and annihilate them!" But it wasn't that simple. The humans weren't playing by the rules the Kyran were used to. The Kyran had always relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, grinding their enemies down with sheer firepower. But humanity had no intention of matching them ship for ship or weapon for weapon. Instead, the humans moved with precision, exploiting every gap in the Kyran formation, every mistake the warlord made. It was like trying to punch smoke. The harder he hit, the more the humans slipped through his fingers. The Kyran ships pressed forward with everything they had, bombarding the human fleet with a relentless barrage of plasma fire and missile strikes. But no matter how many weapons they fired, the humans evaded them with unnerving precision. Their ships danced between the explosions, shields flickering but never breaking. The Valorians watched, their disbelief giving way to astonishment. This was no longer a battle for survival. It was an exhibition of human ingenuity. The Valorians had assumed that sheer firepower would be the deciding factor in this war, but what they were witnessing was something far more dangerous. The humans weren't just surviving, they were outwitting the Kyran at every turn. Where the Kyran relied on brute strength, humanity fought with strategy, constantly adapting to the battlefield, finding weaknesses in the enemy's overwhelming force. One by one, Kyran ships began to falter. They were too big, too cumbersome to maneuver as quickly as the human fleet. And that's where humanity struck. The human admiral had been waiting for this exact moment. He had studied the Kyran's movements, their patterns, and now he saw the cracks forming. The Kyran warlord had committed too many ships to the front, leaving his flanks exposed. The humans seized the opportunity. Without hesitation, the human fleet launched its counteroffensive. But this wasn't a barrage of overwhelming firepower, it was something much more surgical. Human ships, smaller and faster, weaved through the Kyran lines, targeting critical systems with pinpoint accuracy. They weren't interested in flashy destruction. They went for the kill quietly, disabling engines, scrambling sensors, and cutting off communication between the Kyran ships. It took the Kyran warlord a moment to realize what was happening. At first, he thought his ships were retreating in disorder, but soon he understood the truth. His fleet wasn't retreating, they were being dismantled. The humans weren't just fighting a battle, they were picking apart his entire strategy, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. The warlord's anger turned to desperation. He called for reinforcements, but the humans had already jammed his long-range communications. His ships were isolated, alone, trapped in the middle of a battle they hadn't anticipated. The Valorians, who had once resigned themselves to defeat, now watched in stunned silence as humanity, with a fraction of the resources, began to dominate a fleet that had been considered invincible. But humanity wasn't finished. As the Kyran forces reeled from the loss of communication and coordination, the human fleet closed in for the final strike. This time, they didn't hold back. Coordinated volleys of torpedoes and energy weapons hit the Kyran ships with devastating accuracy. Their shields, already strained from the initial exchanges, began to fail. One by one, Kyran vessels erupted in fireballs, gutted by precise human attacks aimed at their weakest points. For the Kyran warlord, this was unthinkable. Never had he encountered a species that could stand against his fleet, let alone one that seemed to outmaneuver him at every turn. He had underestimated humanity from the start, dismissing them as insignificant compared to the other galactic powers. But now, in the middle of the chaos, he realized the full extent of his mistake. Humanity wasn't just another species in the galactic theater. They were something else entirely, something far more dangerous than the Kyran had anticipated. They didn't fight for territory or conquest, and they didn't rely on sheer force to win their battles. They fought with their minds, turning every disadvantage into an opportunity, every weakness into a strength. The warlord's flagship, the pride of the Kyran fleet, was now surrounded by human vessels. His remaining ships were scattered, leaderless, and incapable of mounting a defense. He could feel the end approaching. The humans had played him from the start, and now they were closing in for the final blow. He could have ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The Kyran had never retreated, and the thought of it was enough to make his blood boil. Instead, he ordered his ship to go down fighting, preparing to launch one last desperate attack. But the humans had anticipated this as well. Before the Kyran flagship could fire its final salvo, a concentrated burst of energy from the human fleet struck its engines, disabling them completely. The warlord's ship drifted, powerless, in the cold void of space. His crew was in disarray, his fleet in shambles. And as he stared at the human ships surrounding him, he realized the truth: they had never stood a chance. The Valorians, who had once believed themselves doomed, now watched in awe as humanity completed its victory. The humans had not only saved them, they had done so with a fleet that, by all appearances, should have been incapable of winning. What the Valorians had mistaken for weakness was, in fact, humanity's greatest strength. The Kyran were finished. Their once mighty fleet, which had terrorized the galaxy for generations, was now little more than wreckage floating in the blackness of space. And the humans, who had arrived with what the Valorians thought was their weakest fleet, had just rewritten the rules of warfare. The Valorian commanders, still reeling from the sudden reversal of fortunes, could hardly find the words to express their gratitude. They had underestimated humanity, just as the Kyran had, and now they understood the truth: humanity wasn't a species to be trifled with. They were a force unlike any other, one that didn't rely on brute strength or technological superiority, but on something far more dangerous: their ability to think, adapt, and turn the tide when all seemed lost. For the first time in Valorian history, they had witnessed a battle that wasn't won by the biggest guns or the most advanced ships. It had been won by sheer cunning, by strategy, and by a species that understood that wars weren't just about firepower, they were about winning, no matter the odds. And as the human fleet regrouped, preparing to depart, the Valorians were left with a newfound respect, and perhaps a little fear, for the allies they had called upon. Humanity had arrived, and they had done more than just fight. They had changed the game entirely. The Kyran fleet was no more. What had begun as a routine conquest had turned into a disaster that would ripple through the galaxy. The wreckage of their once feared ships drifted in the void, silent and lifeless, while the human fleet remained largely intact, calmly repositioning itself. The Valorians, who had once viewed this battle as their final stand, now stood in stunned disbelief. They had witnessed a display of power, but not in the way they had expected. The human admiral's voice cut through the silence, calm and matter-of-fact. "The battle is over. The Kyran will not threaten you again." For the Valorian leadership, this victory was nothing short of miraculous. They had been prepared for their civilization to be wiped out, to watch their worlds fall one by one under the crushing force of the Kyran. But now, their enemy was in ruins, and the humans had delivered them from the brink of extinction. The question that weighed heavily on their minds, though, was how. How had humanity, with what appeared to be an inferior fleet, accomplished something so impossible? Valorian High Commander Ilan, one of the few remaining senior officers, approached the human admiral, her face still showing traces of disbelief. "We owe you our lives and our future. But I have to ask, why? Why send this fleet? We were expecting more firepower, more advanced technology. You sent your weakest ships, yet you destroyed them. How?" The human admiral offered a small, almost knowing smile. "We sent the fleet we knew would win. This is not about who has the biggest ships or the most advanced weapons. It's about knowing your enemy. The Kyran rely on intimidation. They overwhelm their enemies by making them believe there's no way to win. We don't fight that way. We study, we plan, and we act when the moment is right. Island couldn't quite grasp it. The Valorian military, like many other civilizations, had long believed that victory came from overwhelming strength. Whoever could bring the most force to bear would win. But the humans had turned that idea upside down. Their ships, their tactics, even their demeanor throughout the battle, it was all part of a plan the Valorians hadn't even realized they were witnessing until it was over. The Kyran, they never stood a chance, did they? Island asked, her voice soft with the dawning realization. No, the Admiral replied simply. They didn't. From the moment they arrived, their fate was sealed. Their strength was their weakness. They were so used to winning through brute force that they never learned to adapt. We knew exactly how they'd respond at every step. And when the time came, we dismantled them, piece by piece. The simplicity of the explanation was staggering. Island and the Valorian commanders had spent so long preparing for their own destruction that they hadn't considered there might be another way. The humans hadn't needed the biggest fleet, they just needed the right one. You could have sent more, Island said, still trying to process everything. You could have sent your best ships, overwhelmed them completely. The human admiral shook his head. That's not how we operate. The goal isn't to show off or to crush the enemy under overwhelming force. The goal is to win. We didn't need more ships, more firepower. We needed a fleet that could execute the plan, and that's exactly what we did. For the Valorians, this was a new way of thinking. They had called for help, expecting humanity to send its strongest armada. Instead, they had received something far more valuable, an approach that had saved not just their military, but their entire civilization. As the human fleet began its preparations to leave, the Valorian leadership gathered to discuss what this victory meant for the future. They had survived a threat that should have wiped them out, and it was all because of the humans' unorthodox approach to warfare. But there was more to it than that. Humanity hadn't just fought for them, they had redefined the entire concept of what it meant to be a powerful force in the galaxy. The Valorians were left to contemplate what the future would hold. Their enemies were gone, but in the back of their minds, a new question arose. What was humanity's place in the galaxy now? They had come to help when called, but what would happen if the roles were reversed? If the humans, with their subtle but devastating tactics, ever found themselves on the other side of the equation? Island knew she would be grappling with these questions for a long time. For now, though, all that mattered was that her people were safe. The Kyran had been defeated, and the Valorians could rebuild. But the lessons learned in this battle would shape the way they approached everything from here on out. As the human ships moved into formation, preparing for their jump back to Earth, Island couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Humanity had proven that they were more than just a new player on the galactic stage. They were a force that could reshape the balance of power with their ingenuity and strategic brilliance. The other species in the galaxy would hear of this battle soon enough, and it would undoubtedly change how they viewed humanity. No longer could they be dismissed as an emerging power still learning the ropes of interstellar conflict. No, humanity had just shown that they were capable of turning even their smallest fleet into an unstoppable force when the situation demanded it. As the human admiral gave the final order to depart, he turned to Island one last time. You'll be fine now. But remember, it's not always about the size of your fleet. Sometimes, it's about knowing how to use what you have. And with that, the human ships blinked out of Valorian space, leaving the Valorians to reflect on the events that had just unfolded. The galaxy had witnessed a new chapter in its long history of conflicts. One where brute force no longer reigned supreme, where the greatest victories came not from the largest armies, but from the sharpest minds. Humanity had proven their strength, not through overwhelming force, but through intelligence and strategy. They had deployed their weakest fleet, but in doing so, they had shown the galaxy that they were anything but weak. And now, the Valorians, and the rest of the galaxy, understood that they were dealing with a species that could win wars before the first shot was even fired. The future had shifted, and humanity was at the center of it all.